outdated, partial, and misrepresentative version of a very limited aspect of yourself. And so are the polls, and so is the news, and so is life. Yet, no one knows what to expect. No one. And no one knows really what to do that could be definitive and not tentative. The so-called experts have been wrong on almost everything about the pandemic. They've been wrong about masks. They're all over the place. They've been wrong about the dating. They've been wrong even about the nature of the virus. They've been wrong at whether it's been a pandemic or not. They've been wrong about where it comes from, where it's going, how long it's going to last, who is going to get it, who is not going to get it. They've been wrong about almost everything. What you see on the public stage of the most powerful, the richest, and the most educated society on earth is exactly what Koheleth is trying to tell all human beings under the sun. He's telling people God's plan is unsearchable. Doesn't matter how rich you are, how educated you are, how powerful you are. If you claim that you know what to do, if you claim that you know what to expect, you are just lying to yourself and to everybody else. God operates at a level infinitely superior to man. And man is under God's complete control. Satan is under God's complete control. He cannot do anything unless God gives him a margin. He could not touch Paul's hair unless God had given him permission, and he could not go beyond the limit that God had set. We have to know that's reality. So our last study in Koheleth on the matter dates from 2 weeks ago. And we studied the thesis of the second major section of the book. We studied chapter 6, verses 10 to 12, and the major section goes from verse 10 of chapter 6 through chapter 11, verse 6. So these verses that we studied, those 3 verses we studied, they declare what I have just stated and illustrated to you. They declare the unsearchable plan of God. That's what he's saying in that thesis. And then he's going to show you how God makes it happen. In that thesis, Koheleth argues in verse 10 that God's resources are infinite. God has foreordained everything. Okay? He already said how he wants it to happen. God has appointed men to be what to be, to be what he's going to be and who he's going to be. He knew I was going to be tall, dark, and hands, and you will be jealous. Okay? You know all of those things. And Igel just find out at a certain point in amazement. Okay? So God, on the other hand, and God is infinitely superior to man. That's what he's telling us in verse 10 of chapter 6. Okay? God is just in an other sphere. Okay? He makes everything happen. You are one of those that he decides how, where, whom you are going to be. And when you try to put the two together, man, it's just, there is no comparison. God is way out there. So when you look at that, there is a contrast in verses 11 and 12. When you see God is infinitely superior, man is infinitesimal in his resources himself in verses 11 and 12. Man's speech is very limited. He is infinitely limited in regard to speech. He is infinitely limited in regard to how to behave. He doesn't know what to do. he is infinitely limited in knowing what to expect. He doesn't know what's going to happen. And if you look at those last two, not knowing how to behave and not knowing what to expect, these two summarize the two major parts of the second major section of the book. The second major section of the book has two parts to it. Chapter 7 and 8, where it says that man doesn't know what to do, and chapter 9 through 11, what is telling you that man doesn't know what to expect. So when he's talking about man in verse 12, and he says three things about man: limited in speech, limited in knowing how to behave, limited in knowing what to expect, he is summarizing to you the proofs he's going to give in the rest of the section. And those proofs are going to tell you why are things the way they are. God set them the way they are because God is infinitely superior. I mean, you will not believe the kind of tricks and plans and strategies and approaches and tactics. I mean, it's beyond anybody in how God is able to make things happen. And here is the way God is setting things. He has a way of mingling things that where you expect good, it's calamity that happen, and when you think calamity is bad, he makes calamity turns good, and when you think prosperity is what you should have, he can make prosperity turn bad. I mean, so how are you going to know what path to take? And that is pretty much what, so in the first major section of the book, in chapters 3 to 6, Koheleth had investigated men's work. And he found men's work to be deficient. So in the second major section, from age 7 through 9 to 11, he has investigated men's wisdom. And he is going to show that men's wisdom is also deficient. Koheleth evaluates the life of man and finds man's wisdom to be completely deficient. He is not able to know what to do. He's not that wise. He's not able to know what to expect. He is not that wise. So man is unable to know what to do, chapter 7 and 8, and man is unable to know what to expect, from chapter 9 to chapter 11. And in each of these points, Koheleth proves the limitation of man with three examples. There are three paradoxes. The paradox is something that appears to be confusing and opposed, but in the end, ultimately, that makes sense. And guess what? That's the way God makes life to be. He puts a pandemic. He puts confusion among races, from Babel to now. And he established men to govern, and right when he put it at the garden, he said, I'm going to make men to lead, but guess what? Women is going to give you a hard time. She's not going to accept that. So he's telling you that's the way it's going to be. And Cain and Abel fought, and then it goes on and on like that. So what you are seeing may take a certain shape. It has always been that way among men. It's only in Christ that you can have true oneness. And if those so-called smart people could solve that problem, man, they would have solved it long ago. And if you ask them today, what's the solution? There is not one of them who has a solution. Not one. There is not a law that they can vote to change it. There is not a president they can elect who can solve that problem. There is not a number of riots that can solve it, and there is not a number of... No! All those things are solved in Jesus Christ. It is solved in Jesus Christ. Okay. So when you look at it, he gives a 3 in each of those two sections. So he says man is unable to know what to do in regard to 3 things. For example, he gives a paradox of adversity versus prosperity in chapter 7, verses 1 to 14. And what he's going to tell you, guess what? Adversity is not necessarily bad. And prosperity is not necessarily good. So you scratch your head, said, man, I thought since I was little, they always told me, seek prosperity, the American dream, and you'll be great. But you are saying that it's not necessarily good. And those poor countries are not necessarily bad. Where is it? God has a way of putting things in convolution because you don't. So what do I have to do? He also shows a second paradox, is the paradox of retribution versus justice, where you find people in spite of who are going to have things happen well, it's where you are supposed to find retribution, you find justice, and where you are supposed to find justice, you find retribution. Now, which one should I pursue? And then he gives a third example in chapter 8, the paradox, the paradox of wickedness versus righteousness in 7 verses 15 to 29, and the paradox of retribution versus justice in chapter 8. So when you look at it, God, you say, man, God, oh, now that I have a PhD, I thought that I had it on the hand. I'm baffled. I can never know exactly how to behave unless I submit to Christ. And then the second part, he's giving us also three paradoxes or examples, telling us that man is unable to know what to expect. For example, there are uncertainties regarding death in chapter 9, verses 1 to 10. When are you going to die? Will you be rich or poor when you die? Who will die first? How is your death going to occur? What happened after death? Can I go and investigate and come back? Why does God make it? I mean, everybody has to die. Couldn't God make it, in a way that we could know exactly the way things are going to happen? And there are uncertainties regarding wisdom. You look at those people who are great experts and scholars, and they are trying to develop the vaccine. They give it to 20,000 people to check it out, and here's one person who developed a strange symptom, and they stop everything. Wisdom has all those uncertainties. And one of them was being interviewed and said, I mean, you stopped the whole thing for one person, and you know what he answered? We do not know. We do not know whether that one person is representative of a whole group. We don't know. We don't know what to expect. And there are uncertainties regarding work in chapter 11, verses 1 to 6. You invest, you do not know what's going to be the dividend. 80% of businesses that are started close down within 2 years. That's a high level of uncertainties regarding work. So you look at this, and you are like, whoa, I am in trouble as a man. Yes, we are. Because God has said it that way so that man would turn toward him. And if you turn toward him, he gives you the key that despite all those things, you can have happiness, triumph, And if you don't turn to him, those things becomes your judgment. So today, we will begin studying the first paradox in the section that goes from chapter 7 to verse 89, and we will only be able to cover one verse, verse 1. So we are going to study man's inability to know what to do in adversity versus prosperity. The first paradox, that paradox between adversity and prosperity. So before we study it, and we have to look at some of the characteristics of those 14 verses. And here's the first one. When you read this, you find, and I'm going to ask you folks to read some verses to see what I'm saying. You read those 14 verses, and you see that they are stated in the form of proverbs. Okay? A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death is better than the day of one's birth. And it goes on and on that way. So the phraseology is the same as you would find in the book of Proverbs. They have maxims and riddles, catchy statements that appear to state a common sense truth, but that is not commonly grasped or practiced by people. As one man said, I found that common sense is not at all common. Okay? So it is stated in the form of proverbs in those verses. And when you know what happened in Proverbs, there is always that sense that all things being equal, that's a premise, what I'm saying is true. Train a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. All things being normal, that will indeed happen. But if you have something abnormal that happens, that the child doesn't listen, okay, that's an abnormal thing for a child to do toward parents, therefore the result would not happen. So all proverbs, they are premise, they are a matter of cause to effect. This cause is going to bring that effect, and it is premised with the logic that all things being normal, that is going to be true. If there is any abnormality, okay, so when you look at the proverb, when it says that train a child in the way you should go, when he is old, he's not going to depart from it, you say, well, I can tell you how many children of pastors who didn't follow that way. Well, we don't know what all the dynamics have been. Whether the pastor himself really trained, whether he had a good example or not, whether, had a wife that caused problem, you never know. But if everything, all the pieces are normal, that will come to the result. So we have this stated as one characteristic in the form of proverbs. So when he's talking about that adversity is not necessarily good, prosperity is not necessarily bad, prosperity is not necessarily good, all things being normal, that's true. Unless there be some God intervenes, something changes something, okay? But all things being normal, that's true. And since it is proverb, it is also poetic. So you find those things, and when we talk about poetry in those verses, we're talking about Hebrew poetry. And Hebrew poetry is characterized by parallelism. It's not characterized by phonetics, as you would have poetry in English. When you are doing poetry, you make things sound about the same at the end. You make things have the same cadence when you are telling them. So and so went to town, and he went to buy this and this. So you have that, chant cadence thing, or you make it sound the same at the end or every other line. That's the way you do poetry in English. In Hebrew, poetry was characterized by parallelism of thoughts. You will find very often they have 2 or 4 lines. Okay, so the 2 lines are parallel to each other, but the relationship between the 2 lines can be in various ways. The first line can be of the same meaning as the second line. And in that way, the parallelism is synonymous. The second line can be in antithesis, in the contrary of the first line. So in that way, the parallelism is called an antithetical. It's antithesis. So let me have the architect read verse 4 for us, and you will see that there is an antithesis of the same. Alison, please, verse 4. Okay, so you see the opposite being said in the 2 lines. It's parallel. They are talking the same thing about heart, but in regard to heart, wisdom is in one side and foolishness is in the other side. It's opposite to each other. So you have them to be synonymous as well. And I'm going to ask Allison's mother to read verse 1. This time, can you find it? Last time I had give you a hard time. Should I skip you?
Ecclesiastes 7.
Verse 1.
A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth.
Okay, so he's saying the same thing with two different objects. A good name is better than, the day of death is better than. So it's synonymous. And Dale, can you read for me verse 3? Chapter 7 of Ecclesiastes. Or should your wife read it? Okay.
Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of the heart is made glad.
Okay, so you see the two lines are pretty much saying the same thing. And I'm going to have Dale's daughter, since he refuses to read, I'm going to have Dale's daughter read that for me, and that's going to be verse 8.
The end of a matter is better than its beginning. Patience of spirit is better than haughtiness of spirit.
Okay, so giving a synonym in both. So when you are looking at Hebrew poetry, look for those. Okay, you go to the book of Proverbs, do that exercise, and you say, okay, is the second line saying the same thing? Then it's synonymous. Is the second line saying the opposite? Then it's antithetical. Or is the second line only giving you a contrast without opposing it? That's the third way. And we have examples of those as well. And for example, verse 2, Patty, can you read that for me, please?
It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart.
Okay, so you see he is making a contrast between two houses, but he is not putting them, to say this and then opposite the second line. So he's contrasting them. And I'm going to have the Vandermollens to read, and you can decide. Don't fight, okay? But I'm going to give two verses. You guys can decide which one you want to read. Verse 3 and verse 5.
Sorrow is better than laughter, for when a face is sad, a heart may be happy.
Okay, so you have that parallelism there, but it's giving you a contrast. And verse 5.
She told me to read both of them.
Ah.
It is better to listen to the rebuke of a wise man.
You see what what she told him to read? Okay, now I know what she's thinking. Okay, go ahead. I wanted her to read that. She refuses. So you are the one saying it. Okay, go ahead, please. Yeah, I would love to hear it again.
It's better to listen to the rebuke of a wise man than for one to listen to the song of fools.
Okay, so you are establishing a contrast here. Okay, so generally, those three categories, that's what you have in parallelism. They are either opposite, either similar, they are saying the same thing, or they are just making a contrast. Okay, but what happened in the fourth part, you know that Koheleth always complicates things. So what he does, he adds some things to those three forms. He uses them all, three forms, but adds a paradoxical cachet to them. He adds a sense as if he was not saying anything while saying much. In fact, some of the scholars look at this and name some of those verses as no idea verses. And he says those things, and you say, what? For example, let's go to verse 4. This is one of those that scholars call no idea verses. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, and the heart of fools in the house of mirth. How would you associate wisdom with? I mean, mourning is not a matter of wisdom or not. That's what you would say. Or, for example, he would say in verse 5, it is better to hear the rebuke of the wise, I just said, than the man to hear the song of fools. So, I mean, so what? I mean, that's what they would call a tautology. I mean, it's a self-evident truth. Okay? And he goes throughout. So when you look at those, Solomon is trying to give you a picture of man doesn't know what to do. So he uses those artifices in what he's saying, and you are like, what are you saying? Making things harder for me and having a whole evening where I will be able to cover one verse. Okay? And the third characteristic, as to be expected, Koheleth uses stylistic figures. And there are principally two that I want to point out in those 14 verses. The first one is what we call the heptad, the group of 7. We had that in chapter 3, from verse 2 to verse 8. There's a time. You had 7 verses with 4 stitches each, which give you 28 elements. So there's a time for this, a time for that. Okay, so you had 7 verses. That was the heptad. And generally, that 7 is representing completeness. Matter closed. So I choose 7 to give you matter closed. You could remember also that when he was giving examples in from chapter 3 to chapter 6, he had given 7 examples as well. Okay? So that was a figure of speech. You'll find in the book of Proverbs there are 5 things in and 7 that is not this, and so to give you completeness of thought. And actually, in those 14 verses, guess what? You really have 7 proverbs. The first one is verse 1, that stands alone. Verse 2 is the second one. Verse 3 is the third. Verse 4 is verse 5. And then you have verses 8 to 10. You see probably in the book, it appears to be one paragraph. Okay? And then you have verses 11 to 12. And that's the 6th one. And then you have verses 13 to 14. That's the 7th one. And you will find in each one of them, there is a key word that he keeps repeating. What do you think it is? The word better. It's better this. And then he gives it, it's better this. So the 7 that he has here are 7 statements. And guess what? That's what he keeps doing. He puts those things in a way and makes you spend a lot of hours because you don't want to stand in front of those smart people at Robinson Baptist who tell you, I really don't know what Solomon is doing here. So you have to find them out. Okay? And so the second part, the second figure of speech, is the one that we call the chiasmus or chiasm. And that is when ideas are bracketed in parallel but expressing the first and the last, alpha and omega, for example. That's a form of chiasm. Okay? So it brackets everything. So here's the beginning and the end and everything that is in between. Okay, so you will find that it talks about wise and fool. So, and all the amalgam that is in between. And so when you look at it, verses 3 and 4, for example, you will find that kind of chiasm. And in verses 5 to 7, you will find that kind of bracketing of opposite. So those are the 3 major characteristics. And when you capture what he's playing with, then things are beginning to make sense. You see? They are beginning to make sense to you, and you are going to try to be able to explain this. So Koheleth is proving that God has mingled together adversity and prosperity to make nearly impossible for men to decipher which one he is experiencing. As a Christian, have you ever been in a situation, you look at it, you said, is that a trial or is it a punishment that the Lord is bringing upon me? They look exactly the same. They look exactly the same. And you do not know what to do. And guess what you do? You go to the pastor. No, you go to the Lord. You go to the pastor and say, Pastor, solve it. And the pastor said, like Jacob's wife said, give me a child or I'll die. Jacob said, am I God? So you go to God. You go to God. And that's what is always the path to take. So you look at it, God mingles things that way. Death is naturally bad, yet God can make it a good thing. You see, wisdom is naturally good, yet he can turn the wisdom of Ahithophel into a curse. And Ahithophel was so wise that whenever he spoke, it was almost God who spoke. And guess what? God turned that wisdom into a curse. It was a curse for Absalom. Both Absalom and Ahithophel died. So wisdom is naturally good, yet wisdom can be destroyed and can lead someone to false hope and false assurances. So Koheleth makes it even more difficult by throwing all these figures of speech to complicate it for man. That stylistic complication is in itself an illustration of the theme being developed in the larger spectrum of the section. Man is unable to know what to do. So now what we have explained, the characteristic of the passage, in verses 1 to 14, I still have not gotten to verse 1 yet. Let us see how the thoughts are divided. So what you have are those three parts in that section of the paradox of adversity versus prosperity. So the first 6 verses are telling you that adversity is not necessarily bad. And the most picturesque aspect of the adversity that you can think is death. And from verse 1 to verse 6, it's talking about as if there are a lot of good things you can get out of death. Better to go to the house of mourning. The day of death is better than the day of birth. He keeps talking about death. You're like, what? So he's taking that to show that adversity is not necessarily bad. And then he goes to verses 7 through 12, he says that prosperity is not necessarily good. It can be perverse. And then, guess what he tells you? After you keep scratching your head until you have no hair. I know that's why a lot of you don't have hair. You keep scratching too much. So he says, verses 13 to 14, let me tell you what to do. You want to be happy? What do you think he's proposing? Obey God's prescriptions. Okay, verses 13 and 14. Consider the work of God. Okay, so guess what in verse 14? In the day of prosperity, hey, enjoy it. Surely God has appointed the one as well as the other. Okay, enjoy God's provision and obey God's prescription. And that's what he's always going to get to. But before he gets to that, he really makes things confusing to you. And guess what? He said, I didn't do that. I'm just telling you that's where God put it. So adversity is not necessarily bad. It can be profitable, verses 1 to 6. So let's look at that verse 1 then that we have. And it says, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death better than the day of one's birth. So let's get each one of the parts here. What we have is that figure of speech that we call a paronomasia, what we generally call in common English a pun. Okay, a play on word. Okay, he's doing a pun here, a play on word. So he says a good name. And for good name, what do you think it is? Okay? It's reputation. So you look at what some names evoke in your mind. If I tell you Adolf Hitler, what if I were to tell you Mahatma Gandhi? What does this evoke in your mind? Lee Harvey Oswald. Or what if I were to tell you Nelson Mandela? What if I were to tell you Judas? What about Daniel? His grandparents are here. You'll better say it's a good name. Okay? What if I were to tell you Esau? What about Paul? So what you have, he's talking about the reputation of a name. And he's comparing it to something that people will tell you, hey, it's like, people are looking at in society, like Pilate, when Jesus is talking about how virtuous and wonderful truth is, and he said, what's truth? For politicians in the United States, truth is just, truth is for sissies, they will tell you. So the counter perspective of having a good name is not what they are thinking. And he says here that it is better. The course of life that makes your name good is of greater value than ointment or perfume. And we're going to explain that. So when you look at whatever process, procedure, avenue that will give you a good name, it's of much greater value than anything else. And that anything else, guess what it is? Prosperity. So you are going to say, where did you get prosperity here? All right. You are going to agree with me very soon. I'm going to get Brian to read for me chapter 9 of Ecclesiastes verses 7 and 8, because that same word that is translated by ointment or oil or perfume in many of the translation is right there in those verses. Read it for me, please.
Chapter 9, 7 and 8. Go then, eat your bread in happiness.
Okay, you just mentioned the word. Happiness. And he keeps elaborating on it. Keep on reading.
Go then, eat your bread in happiness, and drink your wine with a cheerful heart, for God has already approved your works. Let your clothes be white all the time, and let not oil be lacking on your head.
Huh. So he's translating it by the American dream. Happy. Okay? And I'm going to have Brian's wife read Job 29, verse 6. Kim, can you read that for me, please? And you can look at it. And it's there also. So Job is complaining, thinking about what his life used to look like. What did the Bible say his life was? He was very what? Very rich. And he also had a good name before God. But he's thinking about the very rich part. And this is what he says in verse 6 of Job 29.
Job 29:6. My steps were washed with butter, and the rock poured out from the streams of oil.
Pouring out a stream of oil is the image of prosperity. When you eat caviar. Okay? So when this man is using the word oil or perfume, it's that imagery of someone who has everything going for him, and oil is pouring through rocks. Everything is gold in his house. He has prosperity. And Solomon is telling us right at the beginning, Let me tell you right at the beginning the principle. A good name is better than prosperity. And you say to yourself, when do I know that I have a good name? No one is sure and seal of his name until the day of death. And that's why you have the second part where he gives this as a further explanation by saying the same thing, that and the day of death is better than the day of one's birth. At the day of death, you probably know this verse by the way that the Jehovah's Witnesses explain it. The Jehovah's Witnesses are telling you that, hey, the Bible forbids you to celebrate birthdays. Okay? How many of you will have a birthday soon and would like to have a big party? Oh, man. Why do you raise your hand? My credit card is going to suffer. Don't you know that the day of death is better than the day of birth? And we see that Sarah back there. So they say that you should not celebrate birthdays. So you cannot say happy birthday to a Jehovah's Witness. And my sister and my brother-in-law are die-hard Jehovah's Witnesses. But I have to tell you, I have yet to see a Jehovah's Witness having a mother or father die and they say, yeah, let's celebrate. So I asked them, why don't you jubilate if you have a son or a mother or spouse who dies? Because you don't celebrate at birth, but you should celebrate at death. And they will give you that look. I said, I didn't say that. You said that it was. So here again, the point is counterintuitive. The day of death is what settles the good name. So when a person dies, you know what the name has been. When a person is born, you have no clue that he or she would be wise or a villain. So in the context of a good name, where would you like to be? I remember telling a man, and I was much younger than I am now, and he was retiring, and I said, I envy you. I said, man, I envy you. You know how you are ending, and I still have yet to know. I have still no clue. I'm not going to mess it up. I know how not to by submitting to the Lord. But you know that the heart of man is deceitful above all things. Heart of women is not that way. It's heart of men that's it's deceitful above all things. So when you look at it, it is death that provides a better clue on what you need to know. At birth, man is unable to know the story of how life is going to end. At death, you know. So in the context of man doesn't know what to do, at death, you are just proving that you did do the right thing, even when you did not know beforehand. So let me give you the story of Solon and Croesus. The Greek poet Herodotus narrates the story of Solon and Croesus. Croesus was the last king of the kingdom of Lydia. He is reputed to have been proverbially wealthy, hence the saying, as rich as Croesus. He was born in 595 BC. He reigned over Lydia for about 15 years until his death, his defeat by a Persian king named Cyrus in 1546. Croesus was a contemporary of Daniel. He was, they were living in different places. So here's, let me narrate the story better for you as someone else wrote it. Solon, by contrast to Christ, so Croesus had what? Prosperity. Solon, on the other hand, was one of the 7 sages of Greece, the philosopher statesman who first laid down the laws which consequently shaped the Athenian democracy. The former, Croesus, was known for his self-confidence and excess, the latter for his reservation, dignity, and wisdom. It so happened that soon after Croesus conquered almost all of the nations around him in what is today known as Anatolia or Asian Turkey, and was at the very height of his power, Solon visited him at his palace in Sardis. You know, Sardis is mentioned in the book of Revelation. The philosopher had recently finished his reform in Athens, and so that the vow-bound Athenians could not force him to repeal any of them, he had embarked on a journey around the world. So he laid the law and ran away. Knowing full well the reputation of his esteemed guest, Croesus entertained Solon for at least 2 nights and ordered his attendants to show him around his treasures on the 3rd day of the visit. Not that there was any reason for that. Solon was quite aware of Croesus' extravagant wealth, if merely because in Sardis even the temples of the gods were built of gold. However, Solon was not impressed in the least bit by all this splendor, and he seemed even less fascinated by the achievements of his hosts. "How can you not be?" asked the annoyed Croesus eventually. "Have you, on some of your travels, encountered upon someone more fortunate than me? Indeed, my Athenian friend, as one who loves learning and who has traveled much of the world for the sake of seeing it, tell me whom you consider to be the happiest man in the world." Solon was famous for his integrity, so he offered no flattery. "O king," he replied, "it is Tellus the Athenian." "How so?" replied sharply the amazed Croesus, who had been confident that Solon would name none other than himself. "Well," Solon said, "Tellus was neither rich nor poor, and all of his children were good and noble." They had a good name. "He lived to see them give birth to their children and died an old and respected man while volunteering to fight for his country." Not entirely pleased with the answer, Croesus then asked Solon who he thought was next, to which Solon, after some thinking, replied, "Oh, it has to be Aglaus. The man was so happy living on his farm that he never even felt the need to leave it." And that's where he died, admired by his friends and surrounded by his loving family. "And what about the 3rd? And Solon said, "Cleobis and Biton, mighty king. They were healthy and beloved youngsters who always had enough to live on. One day, after the oxen of their mother Cydippe went missing, they yoked themselves to the cart and drove their mother for 5 miles until reaching the temple of Hera, where Cydippe, a priestess, was headed to honor the goddess at a religious festival. Overjoyed and proud, Cydippe asked Hera to bestow the best gift upon her children. She did. They lay down in the temple and died peacefully in their sleep just moments after. They are still fondly remembered by their strength and devotion." The story, a good name is better. So, in one part of the story, which is not mentioned here, Solon told Croesus this: "No man is to be counted happy until he has closed his life happily." So a good reputation is better than prosperity. And it is only at death that this can be proven. So we will continue with, I told you it was going to be one verse. In fact, I'm couple minutes over. So we'll continue with the rest of the study next week, God willing. But you can begin to see that Koheleth has started us fast on the track to show that adversity is not necessarily bad. Death can be the graduation of life to prove that the life had earned a good name at birth. No one knows how that life is going to turn out. And the psalmist says the same thing when he told us, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints, not his prosperous, his saints. Let us pray. Father, we thank you for the study tonight. As we began to study that prosperity is not necessarily good and adversity is not necessarily bad. We do not know which one to pursue, but if we enjoy God's provision and obey God's prescription, everything's going to be all right. Everything is going to be all right. Bless my people as we study this book. And I thank you that I think they are beginning to discover that it's a great book of practical value, but written in a high literary style. And that style in itself is illustrative of how you set life to be. You set life in such a way that man cannot find out, and man therefore has to use you as guide. May we do so and not be arrogant in our ways. In Jesus Christ's name we pray.